Welcome to the deep dive. What truly shapes public opinion? I mean, really, who benefits when an entire population seems to move in perfect emotional unison? And at what point did studying the collective mind stop being an academic curiosity and become, well, an essential tool for people in power?
Those are exactly the questions behind the material we're looking at today. We're diving into a text that, even though it was published over a century ago, basically wrote the playbook for modern mass communication and, you could say, manipulation.
Right.
Gustave Le Bon's foundational work, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind, which first came out in 1895.
Le Bon was a French polymath, a physician, and he was writing during this period of just massive social change in Europe. You have the birth of mass democracy, all the instability that came with it. And his book, which he intended as a scientific look at crowd behavior, it became something else, perhaps unintentionally. It became a masterclass in propaganda.
You really can't overstate its influence, can you? We're talking about a text that was reportedly studied by everyone, from advertisers trying to sell soap all the way to figures like Mussolini and Lenin.
And especially their propaganda ministers.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So the book's core mission was to map how an individual's rational mind, how it transforms or maybe collapses when they join a mass.
Yes. Le Bon wanted to explain why crowds think only with their emotions, why logic completely fails them, and crucially, how this predictability could be, well, weaponized to steer whole societies.
Le Bon saw this as an existential threat. He declared that the age of kings and sovereigns was ending and the era of crowds was beginning. And this power, this rising tide of the masses, he called it the only force that nothing menaces. And that idea clearly terrified him.
It did. And it's so important to understand the world he was in. You have huge political upheaval, industrialization, and this sudden realization that the will of the masses, what he calls the unconscious action of crowds, was replacing the conscious activity of individuals who used to be in charge. He genuinely feared what he was seeing.
And his perspective was deeply elitist, wasn't it? He basically presents the crowd as this fundamentally destructive force.
Oh, completely. He argues that civilization itself is only created and directed by a tiny intellectual aristocracy. Crowds, if you just leave them to their own devices, will inevitably drag society back into a barbarian phase.
And that perspective, that fear, is really the dark heart of the book.
It is, and this is where his scientific analysis becomes this unintentional how-to guide. Le Bon argues that for any statesman to survive in this new era, he absolutely needs to understand crowd psychology, if only to prevent being too much governed by them.
So the goal isn't fairness or justice, it's psychological management.
Exactly. He says outright that the most effective rule isn't based on pure equity, but on whatever produces a strong impression and whatever seduces them. You rule by mastering psychology, not through rational governance.
That is a chillingly practical distinction. It suggests that good policy is always going to be secondary to good optics. How does he actually illustrate this idea, this seduction over fairness?
His most famous example is taxation. Le Bon advises that if a government has to impose a tax, they should avoid at all costs the one that is theoretically the most just.
That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but think about it. If you propose a direct proportional income tax, even if it's very fair and very low, you're asking for a lump sum. That single number immediately strikes the public's imagination, and they will erupt in protest.
Even if it's better for them in the long run.
Precisely. So instead, Le Bon suggests an indirect tax, a tiny charge on, say, every single item you consume. This tax, even if it ends up being exorbitant and far more expensive overall, is paid in tiny little bits.
So you don't notice it.
It will pass unperceived, in his words, because the tiny deduction never hits you with that imaginative shock. It's a perfect illustration of his main idea. People never shape their conduct upon the teaching of pure reason.
Okay, that really sets the stage for the psychological mechanics he gets into. And this is where we find his law of mental unity. What happens to us when we go from being rational individuals to part of a collective?
This is the crucial shift. The conscious personality just vanishes. When people gather, they form this temporary collective mind where all feelings and ideas flow in one single direction. The individual, who might be thoughtful and cultivated when they're alone, becomes, in his words, a barbarian in the crowd, governed only by instinct. He says they genuinely descend several rungs in the ladder of civilization.
So the first big insight is that the collective isn't just the sum of its parts. It's actually dumber and more volatile than any single person within it.
It is.
So what's the mechanism? How does that intellectual collapse actually happen?
The key for Le Bon is suggestibility. He compares an individual in a crowd to someone under hypnosis. The brain's critical activity is paralyzed. Will, discernment, they're just gone. They become, and this is his phrase, an automaton who has ceased to be guided by his will
They stop thinking for themselves.
completely, and they become profoundly open to external direction.
And once you have that highly suggestible state, that's when you get the rapid spread of contagion, right? Which is something you see in, any modern social media outrage cycle.
Absolutely. Contagion spreads feelings and actions instantly. What Le Bon found so fascinating is that it even overrides basic self-interest. An individual in a mob will readily sacrifice their own safety, their own material interests for the collective. And that's something that is very contrary to his nature when he's on his own.
And this all feeds into his most, provocative claim about intellectual inferiority. He argues that in a crowd, it is stupidity and not mother wit that is accumulated.
Yes, mother wit being common sense, basically.
So intelligence just averages down, never up.
Never up. And this weakness is made even worse by the crowd's total credulity, its dependence on illusion. The crowd can't process logic, it thinks only in images.
Images, not ideas.
Right. It accepts images evoked in its mind as reality, confusing what is subjectively felt with what is objectively real. This point is absolutely crucial for understanding modern manipulation. People aren't processing complex policy details. They're just accepting the strongest visual or metaphor you give them. You see this today in ideological echo chambers. If the image is strong enough and repeated enough, it becomes the truth for that group, regardless of the evidence.
So moving from the mechanics to the emotional fuel, Le Bon says crowds only understand simple and extreme sentiments. They don't do nuance or doubt, they always go to extremes.
And that extremism, naturally, breeds intolerance. Since ideas are just accepted as absolute truths or absolute errors, the crowd is inherently despotic. And what's really striking is its attitude towards power. Crowds show a docile respect for force. They despise kindness and often prefer tyrants who vigorously oppress them.
It almost suggests the crowd wants to be led, wants to be disciplined even.
It does. Le Bon argues the crowd's hero will always look something like a Caesar. And yet, this same collective can show incredible self-sacrifice. While they're often criminal because individuals feel anonymous and free from consequences, they're also capable of very lofty morality.
Like what?
Abnegation, heroism. Think of the Crusaders or the volunteers of the French Revolution in 1793. Personal interest, which is the main motivator for an isolated person, is rarely a powerful force for a crowd.
So the ultimate driving force isn't logic or even self-interest, it's faith. Le Bon argues that any political or social creed can only take root if it takes on a religious shape.
This is absolutely foundational to his entire analysis. The psychological traits of religious faith, worship of a higher idea, blind submission, the inability to question dogmas, and the desire to spread them while seeing non-believers as enemies, all of this applies equally to politics.
And this works even without any actual God involved.
Precisely. Le Bon observes that if atheism or socialism were adopted by the masses, they'd acquire that same intolerant religious fervor. He pointed to the cult around General Boulanger, where thousands would have died for him based on pure faith. Or the nihilists, who would replace their religious icons with atheistic texts, but still piously light candles in front of them.
So the object of worship changes, but the psychological mechanism of fanatical belief, that stays the same.
It's identical. And to reach that state, the crowd needs a guide. Le Bon sees the masses as a servile flock that is incapable of ever doing without a master.
And what kind of person becomes a leader of crowds?
They have to possess immense energy and enduring strength of will. Think of men like St. Paul or Muhammad. And these leaders have to master 3 key tools to manufacture belief.
Which are affirmation, repetition, and contagion. It sounds like the 3 pillars of modern advertising.
It is the earliest systematic outline of it. Affirmation has to be simple, concise, and strong. No reasoning, no proof. Just state it. Then repetition. The idea has to be repeated constantly until it penetrates the mind and enters the domain of the unconscious.
So it stops being an idea you think about.
And it becomes a permanent guiding sentiment. It's not about reminding people. It's about bypassing their conscious defenses to embed the message on a deep emotional level.
And once it's embedded, contagion takes over.
Exactly. The sentiment spreads from person to person, and he noted, even from the lower classes to the higher classes. He saw socialist doctrines starting to influence the Parisian upper crust, who he believed would ultimately become their first victims.
Leaders also rely heavily on the magic of words and illusions. It's fascinating how Le Bon says the power of a word has nothing to do with its actual meaning.
It's all about the images it evokes. Vague, ill-defined terms are the most powerful. Democracy, liberty, socialism. These words have a truly magical power because they synthesize all these diverse, unconscious, often contradictory desires. A politician who defines them too clearly loses all their power.
Which is why statesmen have to change the words, but never the things themselves. It's just rebranding governance.
But it's all perception management. And underneath this whole process is the crowd's preference for illusion over truth. Le Bon concludes that error, not truth, is the main driver of history because crowds have always undergone the influence of illusions. Socialism, to him, was the last illusion that is still vital because it so boldly promises a happiness that can't rationally be achieved.
Which makes logic completely useless. If you try to fight an illusion with facts, you're going to fail.
You will always fail. Le Bon tells this incredible story about an orator calming a furious Parisian mob. They were demanding the execution of a marshal they accused of treason. The orator didn't try to reason with them. He didn't present evidence.
So what did he do?
He just promised them pitiless justice and that the prisoner would be kept in custody until that happened. That mere promise of emotional satisfaction, the illusion of control, was enough to make the entire furious crowd disperse immediately.
The lesson is clear. Offer emotional resolution, not a rational argument. Now, connecting this to the world Le Bon saw coming, he noticed that by the late 19th century, the crowd was getting more changeable, less stable.
Yes, the old fixed beliefs were dying out, and the rise of the newspaper press was constantly introducing contradictory opinions. And this led him to a key insight. Governments were becoming powerless to direct public opinion permanently. They could only follow it, usually with a sense of dread. Modern opinions were just too mobile and fleeting. That's a profound insight into our own time, isn't it?
It really is. And his critique of the education system at the time feels especially relevant today. He attacked the system, which was all rote memorization and textbook learning, for producing a population that lacked initiative, judgment, and character.
He argued it created a surplus of diploma holders who looked down on practical work and only wanted bureaucratic jobs. And the result? Widespread resentment and a ready-made army of the discontented. People who become enemies of society because their expectations are completely divorced from reality.
So they're perfectly conditioned for revolt because they were taught how to memorize, not how to think.
Exactly. And that dangerous combination is only held in check by the final tool of leadership, prestige.
And prestige is what, exactly?
He defines it as that force which paralyzes our critical faculty. It can be acquired, titles, a uniform, wealth, but the most powerful kind is personal prestige, a kind of magnetic fascination that's separate from any official authority.
Like raw force of personality.
Le Bon tells that incredible story about General Van Damme, a famously brutal soldier who admitted he feared Napoleon more than God or the devil. That's the power of pure prestige. It just paralyzes reason and commands obedience.
So we have the full toolkit from Le Bon's analysis. The emotional fusion of the crowd, its deep suggestibility, simplifying complex ideas into absolute myths, the power of repetition to bypass the conscious mind.
And the dominance of leaders who operate through this irresistible prestige. Understanding these mechanisms isn't just a history lesson. It's a necessary self-defense against a manipulation that's far more sophisticated today. These tools are now deployed on global digital platforms that create a permanent, reactive, emotional crowd state.
So, to synthesize this whole deep dive, Le Bon gave us the psychological theory of the easily suggestible, emotionally driven crowd mind. He detailed its vulnerability to affirmation, repetition, and prestige.
And Bernays and his successors provided the applied practice. They showed how to exploit that mind through slogans, symbols, and engineered messaging, all delivered through mass media.
Modern institutions, governments, media, corporations are operating directly on the continuum between those two. Understanding Le Bon clarifies why the public is steerable.
And understanding his mechanisms reveals the essential architecture of modern influence. It's all rooted in bypassing individual reason and targeting collective emotion.
So this really leaves us with some unsettling questions about our own collective life. When you feel yourself part of a collective surge, whether it's outrage or excitement, who's guiding the rhythm?
And when a message spreads too fast, when it overrides any kind of debate or nuance, who really stands to gain from that instant emotional agreement?
And if the crowd really does have a mind of its own, how do we make sure we keep our own minds intact?
Awareness is the antidote to influence. And understanding the mechanics of crowds is the first step towards staying awake in a world that is explicitly built to steer us.